The Journey of Square Peg, Chapter 18, Bath. Our journey had been long and exhausting, but we were still a long way off our goal. It was curious to me that in this post-apocalyptic world we were learning so quickly about this period had been the very first when we had had an opportunity to spend real time together as a family and to get to know our country too. We no longer rushed by the wonders of it all, cocooned in a car. Each step was accompanied with the sounds of nature and each other, the sensation of the terrain beneath our feet, and views that abounded. As the journey went on, I became ever more mindful and receptive to these precious sensations. For my part, my connection to the land had always been strong. I was of a generation that grew up playing outdoors and having adventures of my own making. For me, even the colour of mud meant something. It told me whether I was in the chalky downlands of my home, or perhaps the black peat of foreign fells. A smell, a familiar tree, many things welcomed me home. However, my two eldest children had grown up in a digital age, and before the end it had been a struggle to prise them from their screens long enough to experience anything that might lead to dirt under their fingernails. I never tried to force them to do anything. I just tried to make it more appealing, and for whole minutes it was more so, but then they always drifted back to the technology. It would have been easy to get despondent, but look at them now. It was always in them, this connection to the natural world. They were as involved as I was, and they had quickly adapted, spoke more, shared their feelings, and demonstrated their resourcefulness and creativity. I shouldn't have worried. Staying as much as possible on the high ground to afford us a view of our route ahead and the trail behind, we spent a few days plodding on towards Bath, a city I knew very well from my younger days. As we walked, Helen was pensive, asking occasional questions about my decision to capture Maya and about what I thought of her. She never commented on my replies, just kept on walking and asking new questions. She had never talked so much about the men we had killed. It seemed almost matter of fact to her and not worthy of conversation, so I wondered about the sudden lease of life she displayed and the obsession with the woman we had known only a few minutes. I knew my wife had always liked women, but she had never acted on it, to my knowledge anyway. Perhaps this explained the frequency with which Maya was expressed in her thoughts. Before too long I was distracted by our arrival at Claverton Down, and I assured my family of our proximity to Bath, encouraging them. We continued on towards the city, along familiar steep lanes, beyond whose stone walls the land was diminished by the removal of great trees. Gone were the leafy lanes of the approaches. All was a labyrinth of sandstone-lined paths between overgrown gardens and fields. Eventually, we reached the forlorn and abandoned Alexandra Park. From here the view of the city, which in former times would have been one of elliptical and glorious splendour by day or by night, was now a metaphor of the ruin which symbolised our whole sacred isle. Roofs were missing on so many of the Georgian houses in the city below. The regal confidence of this sparse city had turned to a crippled vision, almost resembling the aerial photos of a city bombed to oblivion. But not quite. The walls themselves, as much as one might hope given the lack of timber to shore them up, were still standing. The glass in their windows was mostly shattered, yet the city, for all its brokenness, still raised in me a feeling of elation and joy, much as it had when it was still bustling with the cacophony of life that had enjoyed its many wonderful visages. The city had character then, and like a decrepit old relative with a twinkle still in their eye, it felt somehow wonderful even now. From the lookout I glanced up at the kite which had been with us for so many days, and seemed to take its cue from our relaxation there, flying off to hunt on the hillside miles distant, a black speck circling lazily over wind-swept slopes and the surviving trees on Hangman's Hill. After a day spent observing the city from our vantage point, we followed a steep path down past long abandoned allotments then cut left to a narrow alley between tall townhouses that overlooked the canal and railway station in sturdy rows. They were unbowed by their decay, a tribute to the craftsmanship that created them, back when craftsmanship still had value. We slipped down to the high embankment and under a bridge that led us along a path past low tenements and high churches to the weir beneath Angel Bridge, all the while taking in the beauty of the place, yet always tense and expectant in a way that I never used to feel when I trod this route before. There was eerie calm. The place seemed abandoned, like a modern-day Mayan citadel, breathing life only in the rush of river water over the falls. Below the bridge's beautiful old arches, we took a moment to enjoy the perpetual rush of water flowing to the concentric half-ellipses of the weir. Above them, a gift shop, which had once stood with pride on this most Venetian of architectural triumphs, had collapsed back into the water below, its debris trapping a twisted dam of broken tree branches and the hulls of boats that had slipped their moorings on rotten tethers. The silty water surged through the arches on either side, a relentless demonstration of the power of nature. Above the broken battlements of the fallen shop's remains, the glass windows on the opposite side of the bridge stared blankly at the narrow, silent street, as if in mourning. As we drew nearer to the base of the bridge, the children began to jump and point like excited puppies, desperate to run to the footpath maze by the riverside, its brick-paved patterns surrounded by tall grass they could hide in. Helen accompanied them. Not wishing to risk being trapped in the narrow stairwell that led directly up to the street level, I opted to go forward with my son alone. Pulling the cart, we made our way through the archway beyond a patch of substantial and roughly cut stumps, the last evidence of a row of trees which once mirrored the great stone columns on the opposite bank. Beyond our sight, we could still hear the girls' voices echoing as they laughed and shouted across the maze, which was half encircled by a high brick wall. It seemed they were already as enchanted as I used to be by the beautiful city. I wondered if they would ever be able to move in places like this as carefree as I had. I mourned for the lost freedom to travel without fear of threats. But then again, have we not all just been shuffling through life back then, never truly knowing ourselves or the people and places around us? Now we had time and a fresh appreciation of the simple things in life, nature's bounty and each other. Having scouted the street with Michael, who was thorough in checking the nearby spaces, I radioed Helen to tell her it was safe to join us. We watched her from our vantage point on the bridge. Below us, she lifted our youngest onto her hip and carried her, as only a mother can, up the winding stone staircase that emerged on the street near where we had perched. Rose followed close to her, smiling and chatting happily. There are few times I can remember in the last 2 years that my wife looked so beautiful to me as she did in the golden light of sunset that evening. For too long she had been lost in the clouds of her own storm and in the fog of resentment we felt towards each other. But now in this place that was renowned for a history of healing, her face relaxed and her gaze was open and wondrous. She ingenuously loved cities, always had, unlike her tense country mouse of a husband. It was as if fond memories and the tangible beauty of Bath, even in such a dilapidated state, had lanced through to the person I always believed to still be there. A tinge of hope sprang in me. I was glad to see her again, even if my belief that Helen, that I had married, could still exist, had been little comfort to me all these years spent waiting and hoping. "Shall we keep moving?" she suggested, puffing with exertion as they joined us. Somehow making her painted camouflage face look as beautiful as if made up for a posh night out. "I'll take point. Michael, can you bring up the rear?" I took up the handle of the cart as the children gambolled between us. Turning the corner above the old riverside garden, where bronze statues stood still in eternal guard over weed-ravaged formal flower beds, we spied the small cathedral nestled by the leaf and litter-strewn road. "Shall we keep moving?" she suggested, puffing with exertion as they joined us, somehow making her camouflage-painted face look as beautiful as if made up for a posh night out. "I'll take point. Michael, can you bring up the rear?" I took up the handle of the cart as the children gambolled between us. Turning the corner above the old riverside garden, where bronze statues still stood in eternal guard over weed-ravaged formal flower beds, we spied the small cathedral nestled by the leaf and litter-strewn road. Beyond it lay the enclosed square by the old Roman baths. The last time I had seen it, it had been thronging with tourists, crowding around street performers, eating Cornish pasties and ice creams and being badgered by vagrants. Such was the melting pot of the city. Ever cautious, I hid my clan in the narrow shopping alley that ran downhill to intersect the square by the cathedral entrance door. Remembering that the bathhouse was roofless over the pool itself, which, with as much stealth as I could muster, I climbed its wall to avoid entering by the street doors. Lying on my belly on top of the wall, I could see the whole enclosure within. It was almost unchanged since I had last seen it, a timeless monument where the water was tinged green. With great care I climbed down, much practice on raided yachts making me sure-footed in the endeavour. Remarkably, the glass in the windows around the building remained unbroken, and for the first time since leaving the Ark in the bay, I found myself in the wonderful atmosphere of a space lit by the sun but without draughts of any kind. I lingered by the pool, a man-made yeti in my muddy ghillie suit, standing in odd contrast to the splendour of the beautiful architecture and the naked statues that adorned it. Drawing my pistol, I swept the entire building, checking the bolted doors and windows and searching each room as briskly as possible. Satisfied that it was free from occupants, I radioed my waiting family to come to a window near the alley, opened it from within, and lifted in my precious cargo. At first, they simply took in the beauty of the historic interior in the diminishing light as I had done. Steam rose languidly from the hot spring-fed pool at its centre. My daughters laughed and called, their voices echoing off the timeless walls laid here by workers' hands so many years before. As the warm air penetrated our clothes in the confines of the bathhouse, it soon became desirable to strip off our layers of outdoor attire. Before long, we'd slipped off our boots too, and sat with our feet trailing in the water, my son tracing figure eights in its warmth as he held his youngest sister on his lap and taught her new words like pool and warm. Her little voice repeated them back with remarkable accuracy. I watched with great love, my pride and joy filled with gladness that my children got on so well. Michael's feet swirled in the water, blackened with dirt and covered in blisters, but to Eve he seemed flawless. Before long, Eve heard mention of swim, and under her dogged cajoling, it was decided that the chance to take a dip here could not be missed. Michael, perhaps self-conscious given his age, chose not to, his teenage excuse being that he did not like to swim, although I was sure he would have enjoyed it really. He sat instead on sentry at the window, my gun nestled in his lap, glancing at once out into the city and back to his frolicking sisters as they clung to our necks, surging through the luscious swirling water of the murky pool. Moonlight shone in from the windows and the open space above the walls, such that, although now nightfall, I could see the face of my wife on the opposite side. The camouflage cream was now washed away, and she glowed as she had the first night we'd made love. Her features and her shoulders were thin, the prominent cheeks ruddy in the warmth, their fine architecture as beautiful as her daughter's. As I lifted my sweet babies, their silky skins sliding on my wet chest hair, their fat cheeks against my own as they embraced me, As I revelled in that sheer joy of the closeness that I had never taken for granted, I noticed Helen looking at me. Her eyes darted back and forth between the water surface and me, as if conflicted, wondering perhaps as I did how to step out into the chasm between us. Seized by a desire to act, to begin to bridge the gap. Sensing this, I swam to her, Babe holding on around my neck, and brushed my hand over her naked shoulder. I smiled without surety, and I swam away again, to give her space and time. I loved her. I always had. We had both lost each other somehow. Joy and laughter echoed around us as our children played, their voices the music that accompanied our delicate pirouette of reconnection. Having swum for what seemed like hours, we finally left the warmth of the water to dry our wrinkled skin. It was the first time we'd been really clean all over for many months. Skin breathing and fresh, we wrapped the girls in towels we carried in our bailout bags. Then I sang them hushed nursery rhymes at Eve's request, holding her close against the night chill as we huddled in the darkness. Seeing how content we were, after some cajoling, my son finally agreed to strip off and swim too. The girls leapt back in to join him, of course, boundless energy matched only by their openness for an opportunity for fun. They clung to him, ignoring the slick of grime that trailed in his wake. I sat by Helen, smiling at the scene, but unable to start a conversation with her. Too many times I had been rejected, kept at bay. Too many times the cold shoulder had met me, and too much time had I spent retreated behind high walls within. So, she began, breaking the silence, coquettishly, "You're all clean then?" I smiled at her, knowing her meaning. There was a glint in her eye. "I missed you." She leaned in to kiss me. "Me too," I replied. I was smiling broadly, but I was hurting. Her lips felt familiar. She tasted good, but the bitter sweetness of her gesture was scything through me. She looked puzzled at my reaction. I took this moment to begin scouting for supplies. By the torchlight within the main building as I hunted, I spied my face in a grandly framed mirror. Stepping close, I found an old man staring back at me, thin and greying, a long beard tangled, a jarring scar giving me a permanent squint in one eye. And that eye was a reflection of my soul, flickering with a pall of dim and careworn light. How hard it had been to fight each step these many years past. So much it had cost me emotionally, and how much that cost was so keenly displayed there in the contours of my face. Where was the person I had been, long before Helen, long before the descent into madness and collapse? My heart cried out for the carefree days of my life before it all, the belief in a bright future, and the assumptions it would be mine. What of all that confidence now? Not wishing to hold my own gaze, I returned to the pool empty-handed. I took over from my wife on sentry duty near the window, and then attended to urgent needs. As I worked, it dawned on me that perhaps this was the bright future I'd always been destined for. There was much to be glad of. We were alive, and the black dog had no place here. I rallied a little. In the moonlight, I could see the stone-carved characters ascending the ladders up the cathedral spires on their ascent to heaven. Warm, clean, and wonderfully tired, I felt like I was on that ladder too. Once my son had swum an hour or so, we dried off the girls again and ate a meagre meal of nettle soup. We shared a tin of sardines between us and washed it down before refilling our canteens from the faucet that delivered the acrid sulphur water into the tea room overlooking the pool. Belly full and tired out, Eve began to nod her head. Before long she fell asleep, breastfeeding in a warm embrace. Soon it was time to move on. Darkness would be safest for crossing the city. So in the early hours we slipped back out of the building, collected our cart from the shopping arcade, and made our way in silence uphill towards Victoria Park. 2 years ago, our footsteps would have crunched on fallen leaves there, but the great trees were long gone now. The giant discs of stumps, hidden in tangled grass dotted with wildflowers, glowed in the darkness to mark their former locations, a silent vigil for the past. Some things, when lost, are lost forever. Having passed the drained duck pond as we made our way along the avenue, we came in time to the low metal fence surrounding the botanical garden. Careful to check we were not followed, we entered through the broken iron gate and crouched low, listening intently before proceeding further. Cautiously I went ahead, following winding paths to scout the space as my eyelids grew heavy. With the garden being only 4 acres or so, I soon located the hidden enclave just within its northern border, a vaguely remembered place by a secluded pool that I knew could not be seen from the road. Satisfied, I signalled by radio for my family to advance, then walked back to meet them in the gloom. Even though the big trees had been felled and the garden was overgrown, its inhabitants, which included some rabbits judging by the signs of digging everywhere, projected its intransigent beauty and soothing notes upon us, as it always had before. The last time I had been here, I was young, and it was adorned with a crown of bright blossom. "What are you picking?" I asked Helen as she harvested petals and cone-shaped flowered heads from a tangled border. "Echinacea," she replied. Doubtless it had some use to us. For her, this garden was an oasis of opportunity. It was a blessed feeling to it, and I felt privileged to be able to stay there the night for the first time. And although our meal in the baths had been small and I could have eaten, it felt wrong to take the lives of the resident animals within this space. I preferred to go hungry rather than to disturb its spirit. Instead, I set up the shelter to keep myself occupied, checking the girls had completely dry hair before tucking them into their thick sleeping bags, heads stepped towards the windbreak made from our grab bags. When I fell asleep that night, curled against the cold in my chilled sleeping bag, Helen's face was on my mind. A few hours later, as the sun began to rise, I spent my watch sitting near the lost temple of Minerva. I was thinking long and hard on what had happened to my country and to my life when my babies came to find me. I waved my hand to help them see me, camouflaged as effectively as I was. I placed my bow on the ground at my feet and opened my arms to receive my 2 bundles of perfection as they ran into my embrace. They smiled and laughed, talking nonsense, picking berries and leaves from the surviving flora, wondering at the unusual plants. As Eve became preoccupied with a ladybird that crawled about on the flagstone path, Rose settled, leaning against me. Without the distraction of her sister, she became silent, melancholy. "Are you okay, baby?" I asked her gently as I put my arm around her. No answer came. "What's troubling you? Do you want to tell me?" Her eyes were a window to a troubled soul, and then her timid voice delivered a heartbreaking question. "When I shot that man with the blowpipe, did I kill him? Would I go to hell?" I gulped back the lump that formed instantly in my throat. No child should have to ask such a question. I had failed her, failed to protect her carefree childhood and her innocence. All for a tiny deer, nothing more than a belly full of meat. "No, my darling," I replied, summoning all my will to answer in an even and sure tone. "You remember how I always used to say, 'Be kind and clever'? Well, you were. You made him feel less pain, and now he is at peace. He will be glad you helped him, and when you are a very old lady and you are ready, you'll become an angel, and we'll all be there with you. You won't go to hell. Never." She sighed, turned and smiled at me, satisfied and relieved by my answer. Then she leaned her elbow on my lap and her head against my shoulder, observing her sister quietly. Though I knew Helen had no regrets at protecting her children with deadly force that day, I determined to ask Michael how he felt too, for his was a visceral and vital experience. He had saved us with his courage and guile, had intentionally wounded more than one. What had been the price he paid? As I pondered, Rose rejoined her sister, and they began to laugh about something Eve had said. Michael had made that moment possible. Whatever the price, I knew he would pay it gladly 1,000 times over. Watching my girls, I made up my mind to take them down to the play area that bordered a once busy road a few hundred meters to the south. So it was that later that morning they spent 2 happy hours running about in a weed-strewn, rusty enclosure full to bursting with wonderfully complex obstacles. They laughed as they ran, my youngest following her sister's example to try ever more daring feats, from climbing to sliding, dangling to dancing. How brave children are. It was a momentary lapse of the new brutal order, a glimpse of a life that no longer existed. As I watched them, hidden as sentry on the bank above as Michael chaperoned them, I vowed that my children would lead a comfortable and happy life someday, no matter what sacrifice it might take. Time wore on, and they finally relinquished their new favourite place in order to climb up into the cart, where they slumped happily in an exhausted heap. Having played a clapping game with them a while, each of us swimming in a cocktail of healthy hormones, we wrapped them up warmly to doze the afternoon away. They lay smiling, each chewing one of our precious few licorice sticks, blackened lips and tongues wagging as they gave voice to the impressions of their day. I never felt more proud than to see them there, so able to ride the highs and lows of our life, and to do so with such immaculate positivity. I had much to learn from them. Some hours later, having picked our way northwest from the city through the rolling countryside, we entered the untouched avenue of stately beeches on Hangman's Hill. As we took in the cathedral-like space within, we were satisfied, bonded, and full of joy at the blessing of our lives. The lonely call of the kite mingled with the rustling leaves in the light breeze as we gazed out from the summit over distant hills. Then quite suddenly a vole shot out from the undergrowth near our feet, flushed out towards the open field beyond the fringe of the forest. The kite reacted instantly, spiralling sharply to intercept the hapless creature as it raced across the open ground. Having made the kill, the great bird stood regally over the prize, shrouding it with shimmering wings, vigilant for the few moments it spent earthbound, before hoisting its limp catch into the air and retreating to a nearby pole. In that moment, captivated by its majesty, I saw in its eyes unexpected depths. We camped one night there on the hill, glad of the clement weather, for our altitude meant lighting a fire was too risky. The nights were drawing in and becoming colder. Huddled together, we listened to music instead, humming to some jazz played on my phone, the children clapping and nodding in the blue-tinged light from its screen, the ancient way of being together, enhanced by modern ingenuity.